Story 1. Backstory. Our company was moving one of its remote sites to a new building. As the IT guy for the company, I was tasked with checking out the new building and marking out where we'd need network ports. The landlord flat out refused to install any low-voltage lines, and the quotes we received for the job were ridiculously high, in the thousands. So, I took matters into my own hands. I packed my car with 4 boxes of Cat6 cable and hit the road. It was about an 8-hour drive, and I had around 30 network drops to install, not too many, but enough to keep me busy for a few days. The building was already built, and the work involved going through drop ceilings covered with insulation. Messy, itchy work. Story. Day 1. We arrived on a Monday morning, right at the start of the month. It was a cool summer morning, and since we were from further south, we didn't notice right away that the air conditioning wasn't working. About an hour in, the building started heating up. By noon, it was around 80 degrees, and by 3 p.m., it was pushing 85. The rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows turned into greenhouses, and the heat was unbearable. We asked some workers on site, and they told us the leasing company had known about the broken AC for 3 weeks. To make matters worse, the building still had workers all over it, and it wasn't even finished. So much for being ready on day 1. Day 2. We were getting frustrated. It was already 80 degrees when we walked in first thing in the morning, and the heat only got worse throughout the day. The facilities manager who came with me was furious and spent most of the day yelling on the phone, trying to get someone to fix the AC. By 3 p.m., we were all drained from the heat. While working on the ceiling, I found a massive 4-foot hole in the ductwork. The AC was blowing, but no cold air was coming through. We were told the compressor was broken. Day 3. It was another miserable day. By this point, I had almost finished running all the network lines, and just as I was finishing up the patch panel, the AC guys arrived around 10 a.m. They managed to fix the unit by 2 p.m. Curious, we asked them what they had done. Their response? A lot of things. We pressed them for details, and they replied, "We can't tell the tenants." Huge red flag. We contacted our realtor, who sent us an email later that night stating they had changed the refrigerant from an older type to a newer one. I told the facilities manager, no way they did that in 4 hours. Changing refrigerants requires replacing the whole system, and they didn't do that. They had just patched it up temporarily, and I knew it was going to fail soon. Day 4. There was still no running water in some areas. Workers were still all over the place, and the AC was struggling to keep up with the midday heat. The temperature hit 80 degrees again by the afternoon, and the AC ran non-stop. We started packing up all the equipment we had moved in, deciding it was time to get out. While packing, I noticed something strange with the fire sprinklers. The metal protection around the drop ceiling had fallen to the floor, and the sprinklers weren't in the right position. In some places, they were barely protruding from the ceiling tiles, while in others, they were hanging much lower. It didn't take long to figure out what happened. The AC guys had stood on the fire sprinklers while working on the ducts. At this point, we needed a way out. We contacted the landlord, telling him that the building wasn't finished and that we were moving out. He refused to let us out of the 5-year lease. Things were getting bad. We called our corporate lawyer, and after reviewing the lease, he said we were in a tough spot. Then, one of our employees who was helping move equipment mentioned, "I never saw any building permits around here." That was our light bulb moment. They had done the entire build-out, including demolition, plumbing, power lines, and the fire system, without any city permits. Time to make a call to the city inspector. Day 5. I wasn't on site, but the facilities manager told me what happened. The city inspector came and pulled the permits for the building. Turns out, there weren't any. The inspector found multiple violations of city codes, and they red-tagged our entire area, removing the building's certificate of occupancy. When the facilities manager asked him to check the fire system, the inspector's face dropped. "Oh no, he said, "I have to make a call." He called the fire marshal. Day 8. The fire marshals arrived, and things went downhill fast for the building. They found that there was no working alarm system in our part of the building. Another red tag. Then they found the sprinkler riser for the entire building in our area, and it had no water pressure. The building was condemned. In the end, they wouldn't let us out of the lease at first, despite delivering an unfinished building. But after we called the inspector and the fire marshal, they were in big trouble. The building was condemned, and we're still fighting them to get reimbursed for not just the deposit and rent, which we've already gotten back, but also for the time and money we wasted moving in and running cables. Our lawyer says they don't stand a chance and is ready to make them cover his fees too. Story 2. This incident occurred a few years ago. As a bit of backstory, I had to have surgery to remove kidney stones. They inserted a device called a JJ stent, which would need to be removed on the day this event took place. All of this happened in the waiting room of my surgeon's office while I was waiting to be seen for the stent removal. It's worth noting that my surgeon's office is on the hospital campus where I work. Cast: entitled mother, entitled child, nice father, me, nurse, co-worker 1, co-worker 2, supervisor. I arrived at the doctor's office in the morning, and the waiting room was mostly empty except for a few people. I signed in with the nurse at the front desk and found a place to sit. Having arrived about 30 minutes early, I pulled out my laptop to finish some reports for work. My laptop is a Panasonic Toughbook with a privacy screen, which becomes important later. A few minutes after I had taken out my laptop, I noticed a child screaming at his mother that he was bored. The child saw my laptop and ran over to me, leading to the following exchange. Entitled child: I'm bored. Let me play a game. Being as polite as I could, I replied, I'm sorry, but no, I have work to do, so please leave me be. The child then ran back to his mother, who subsequently approached me. Entitled mother: my child is bored. Let him play a game on your computer. Me: I'm sorry, but no, ma'am. I have work I need to finish. Entitled mother: come on, you can just do it later. My son needs something to do. Entitled child: I want to play, I want to play. The child was screaming this the whole time while the entitled mother was trying to get my laptop. Entitled mother: you can play in a minute, honey. In a stern voice, she continued, my son just wants to play a game. What's the harm in letting him play? Me: for one thing, this is a work laptop, so even if I wanted to, he could not play on it. Entitled mother: that's nonsense, you're just being selfish. Mind you, at this point, her shouting at me had gotten the attention of one of the nurses, who came over to try to defuse the situation. Nurse: ma'am, please lower your voice. What seems to be the problem here? Entitled mother: this woman refuses to let my little angel play on her laptop. Nurse: well, ma'am, it is her laptop, not yours, so she can do with it as she wishes. Entitled mother: well, my child is bored and needs something to do. Me: well, maybe you should have thought of that before coming here today. This enraged the entitled mother, who exclaimed, how dare you tell me how to be a mother, you inconsiderate person. The nurse who came over knew who I was since I work for the hospital and just looked at me, then back at the entitled mother with a, you shouldn't have said that, lady look. I calmly and silently closed my laptop and put it back in my bag. Entitled mother: what are you doing? I told you to let my child play a game. After I had closed my bag and locked it, it's a nice hard laptop bag with a lock, I stood up and reached into my purse to pull out my work ID, which happens to be a police badge. This is where it gets interesting. The hospital I work for has a fully licensed police department on campus, for which I am an officer. Me: ma'am, I'm going to ask you this once and only once. I showed my badge. Go sit down and leave me be, or I will have you escorted from the campus. I didn't want to cause more of a scene. Plus, I didn't want to have to write another report on top of the one I was currently working on. The entitled mother and entitled child left the waiting room, and I sat back down. The nurse and I laughed, thinking it was the end of things. I was then called into the back to see my surgeon. About 30 minutes later, I was finished and ready to head out. I returned to the waiting room to talk to the nurse before leaving. As soon as I opened the door, I saw the entitled mother and entitled child standing in the waiting room talking to co-worker 1, co-worker 2, and the supervisor. The supervisor came over to me. Me? Good morning, sir. Let me guess, she's claiming I'm impersonating an officer. Supervisor. Yeah, and that you stole her child's laptop. I explained everything that had happened, and the nurse also gave her statement, which of course backed up everything I said. Plus, we have cameras everywhere, so it was recorded. Supervisor. Entitled mother, please have a seat. Entitled mother. No, I want to stand. Supervisor. First things first, you need to calm down. Entitled mother. I'll calm down once that woman gives me back my son's laptop and you arrest her for lying about being a police officer. Supervisor. Entitled mother, do you know that filing a false police report is a crime that you can be arrested for? With a snobby tone, the entitled mother replied, Are you implying that I'm making this all up? Supervisor. Me, would you come here please and set the laptop case on the table? Me. Yes, sir. I placed the laptop bag on the table between the supervisor and the entitled mother. Supervisor. Please open the case and prove to me that this is yours. Entitled mother. Okay. She tried to open it, but I had locked it, and only the supervisor, and I knew the combination. Entitled mother. That woman changed the combination. Supervisor. Me, please open the case. I opened the case, and the supervisor pulled out the laptop. Supervisor. Entitled mother. Is this the laptop that you claim is yours? Entitled mother. Yes, it is. Supervisor. So you claim to have bought your son a Panasonic Toughbook? Entitled mother. Yes. Now let me have it back. Supervisor. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this laptop is property of the hospital's police department. Entitled mother. Then she must have stolen it from you guys. You need to arrest her now. Supervisor. Entitled mother, you need to calm down before I arrest you for filing a false police report. Entitled mother. What about her? Supervisor. What about her? Entitled mother. Aren't you going to do something about her impersonating an officer? She clearly doesn't look like one. She looks like a woman of questionable character. I was wearing my workout clothes as I had plans to go to the gym after my appointment. With that, she stood up and slapped me across the face. Me? What in the world? Supervisor. Me, do you want to file charges? Me. No, but she needs to apologize for that, or we can charge her with assaulting an officer. I was willing to let everything go and not have her arrested due to the fact that the entitled child was there. I didn't want to traumatize the child any more than he already was. Entitled mother. Why should I apologize? I did nothing wrong. At that moment, the nice father walked into the waiting room and asked co-worker 1 what was going on. Co-worker 1 explained the situation. Nice father walked over to us. Nice father. Entitled mother, give me the car keys. I'm going to take our child out to the car. The entitled mother gave the nice father the keys, and as soon as he had them, he told the supervisor to do whatever we had to. Supervisor. Me, do you want to rethink charges? Me. Yes, I will press charges. The supervisor arrested the entitled mother. She would have gotten off with just the assaulting an officer charge, but she resisted arrest and, in the process of doing so, accumulated 2 more counts of assaulting an officer and disorderly conduct. We later found out that she has a history of causing trouble and has had dealings with local police in the past. The nice father came in a few days later with the entitled child and apologized for her actions. He explained that this was his last straw and that he was filing for divorce and full custody of their child. The situation wasn't that bad in the end. He even apologized to me and gave me an "I'm sorry" card. A few months ago, the entitled mother was released from jail and was in the emergency room at the hospital causing a scene, which is why I remembered this story and decided to share it. Update: since quite a few of you have asked about the scene from the emergency room, I will add it to this post later tonight once I finish work and get the rest of the story from the supervisor. Story 3. So, I used to work as a cashier at a supermarket. This story took place on my 4th day of work, and it was only my 2nd day working at the register on my own without a supervisor by my side showing me the ropes. Yep, I had 2 days of training. You'll probably figure out which country I live in from the next explanation, and it'll become relevant later. Supermarkets here are chaotic on a normal day, but Thursdays and Fridays are a special kind of nightmare. Fridays, the store closes 2 hours before sundown, as do most stores in the country. This means the store closes around 2 p.m. in winter and closer to 4:30 p.m. in summer. People go crazy on Fridays, rushing to finish their shopping and get home in time to cook dinner. If you can avoid shopping on Friday, please do. I always told people this after that day. Thursday is hectic too, because we get all the customers who don't want to brave the Friday madness. Now, it was early evening on a Thursday, and the store was packed. We had 10 checkout lines open, and every line had at least 6-7 people waiting. So, if you got stuck with a slow cashier, you were stuck unless you had 10 items or fewer. There was no escape. Everything was going fine until a customer came up with **2*** shopping carts full of items, mostly non-perishables. These were the huge carts you find in big stores like Walmart. I later found out that he was buying for a community center in his neighborhood and stocked their pantry twice a year. Nice guy. He greeted me politely and then said the most dreaded words I could hear that night. "This will be a delivery." Quick break to explain why this was dreaded, especially on a day like today. When someone requests a delivery, the cashier has to call a store helper to bag the groceries. Normally, people bag their own stuff. The bags are then placed into plastic containers, stacked, and stored in the fridge until delivery. A regular delivery is about 3-5 crates. I then have to input the crate numbers, the delivery address, and phone number into the system, print out a receipt, and place copies in the crates. Even a small delivery takes extra time. Back to the story. This guy had 2 full carts and wanted a delivery. I said, "Sure, no problem," and then turned to everyone in line to let them know this would take longer than usual and apologized for the delay. We do this so people can switch lines if they're in a hurry. The whole line groaned in unison. I didn't blame them. There was nowhere else to go. I saw them all craning their necks to check other lines, but they decided to stay. I started scanning as fast as I could. Even though it was only my 4th day, I was pretty good with the codes, so things moved quickly. But soon, the bagger couldn't keep up, and the area where I placed scanned items became a mountain of cans, bags of chips, and other stuff. I couldn't scan anything else because items were falling back onto my scale. I stopped and asked if the customer wanted help bagging. Both the customer and the bagger were grateful, so I helped for a few minutes to clear some space, then got back to scanning. This pattern continued: scan, stop to help, clear space, repeat. This is where Karen enters the picture. She looked to be in her early 40s with long brown hair. She didn't look like the typical Karen, but her attitude was another story. She was standing 5-6 people back in the line, one hand on her hip, leaning so far to the side that I wasn't sure how she stayed balanced. "Karen, hello? What are you doing?" I didn't respond because I didn't think she was talking to me. I kept scanning. "Karen, excuse me, what kind of cashier are you? Why aren't you doing your job? Stop being lazy and do your job." "Me? I'm sorry, ma'am, I'm just trying to..." "Karen, that's not your job. You're a cashier. Do your job. Do your job." Looking back now, I realized this was the perfect opportunity for some malicious compliance, but it was only my 4th day, and I didn't know better. I sometimes wish I had just sat back and been a cashier until there was space for more items. Maybe next time. Me, I'm just helping to move things along faster. If this is a problem, Or if you're in a hurry, you can switch to another line. I'm sure another cashier would be happy to help." I said this nicely, not sarcastically, but I'm sure it didn't help. Karen ignoring me completely. "Just do your job. You're a cashier. What is wrong with you? You should be fired." At this point, I stopped responding and just kept helping to bag and scan. I knew nothing I said would make a difference. That's when one of my managers, let's call him Joe, approached Karen. Joe was great, always ready to help. "Joe, what seems to be the problem?" "Karen, your cashier is lazy. She isn't doing her job. You need to fire her. She's not doing her job." Joe glanced at me, immediately understood what was going on, and turned back to Karen. "Joe, can't you see she's trying to help? She's just making things go faster." Karen started screaming, even louder, practically foaming at the mouth. She was furious, waving her arms around, spitting out incoherent words. Joe tried to calm her down, but that only made things worse. Suddenly, I noticed an older woman, maybe around 80, tapping Karen on the shoulder. After a few tries, she finally got her attention and spun her around. Older woman: "Hey, Karen, excuse me, Karen." "Karen, what?" Older woman: "Your daughter is crying." The entire store fell silent. Everyone looked down, and there was a little girl, no older than 4, clutching Karen's leg, bawling her eyes out and hyperventilating. The poor girl was terrified, and I couldn't blame her. Her mother was losing it in a crowded store, and she had no idea what was happening. The silence lasted all of 2 seconds before Karen started yelling at Joe again. "Karen, look what you did. You and your lazy cashier made my daughter cry." Things escalated quickly after that. Karen swung at Joe, and she would have hit him if the older woman hadn't grabbed her in a bear hug to stop her. Yes, you read that right. The 80-year-old woman grabbed Karen in a bear hug. At that point, other customers got involved, trying to separate the older woman from Karen and stop Karen from going after Joe. Then, mall security stormed in, and the crowd surrounded Karen. I couldn't see much anymore, but judging by the sound of the yelling getting farther away, I figured security was leading Karen either to the back office or the mall security office. Meanwhile, I kept scanning and bagging the customer's items. He thanked me profusely for helping with the bags, even though it wasn't part of my job. He said I was the nicest and fastest cashier he had ever met. I was just happy to help. No one else in my line complained. In fact, I got a few compliments for keeping my cool. After the rush died down, I went on break and started telling a coworker what had happened. He laughed and said, "She was yelling at you." "Ha ha ha." I heard it. Well, everyone heard it, but I had no idea what was going on. He then told me that Karen had been escorted out of the store in handcuffs, and we spent the next 30 minutes laughing about it. I have no idea what happened to the little girl. I assume someone from the family came to pick her up. I also never saw Karen again in the year I worked there. Hopefully, she learned to shop on less busy days or maybe ended up in some legal trouble. That was the first Karen I dealt with while working at that store, but definitely not the last. Story 4. My mom has always been very attentive to my younger sister, making sure she's happy and comfortable, but she never really seemed to care about me in the same way. For example, once, my sister got a lunchbox packed with candies and a sandwich, and all I got was an apple. I've always done well in school and enjoyed studying, but my sister hated it. Whenever deadlines approached, she'd cry or complain about having a headache and beg me to do her work. She'd even make up stories to tell my mom, and I'd end up doing everything for her. I didn't mind helping at first, but she's incredibly spoiled and has major anger issues. If I ever refused to help because I was tired or busy, she'd scream in my face and cry, and my mom would severely punish me. This was just how things always went. One year, when I got my annual report card, I was so proud. I had great grades, and I couldn't wait to tell my family, especially my dad. I waited until dinner when he got home so I could share the good news with everyone. But, of course, nothing went as I had hoped. At the dinner table, I said, "Hey Mom, Dad, I got really good grades. "I'm so happy." My dad congratulated me, saying, "That's great, congratulations." But the silence from the rest of the table was suffocating. I glanced at my sister, and she just stared at me, stopped chewing, then suddenly stood up and ran upstairs crying. My dad, always calm, said, "Oh darling, it's okay." But what my mom did next? The details are fuzzy because it all happened so fast. My mom started screaming at me so loudly that I just went quiet and stared down at my plate, ashamed. I already knew she would say something about me being too happy, but I wasn't prepared for what followed. I've always struggled with bad headaches, and when people yell at me, I start feeling nauseous, dizzy, and sometimes even faint. My mom grabbed my arm and dragged me into the kitchen. She continued yelling, slapped me several times, and let all her anger out by hitting me. When she was done, she looked me in the eyes and said, "You were the mistake in this family. You think you're always the best, but today you're going to be put in your place." From that moment on, I stopped sharing anything about my life with my family. I rarely talk about my problems, my grades, or even simple things like what I did the previous night. That day left a deep mark on me. My dad tried to defend me, but it just led to a fight. My mom never let him intervene when it came to how she disciplined us. She always said, "I know what I'm doing, Roman, you can't handle it." And my dad would back off whenever she started yelling. I went upstairs, locked my door, and cried myself to sleep that night. Even though my sister failed that year, I still had to help her with her schoolwork. She never wanted to learn, she just wanted the answers. If I tried to explain anything, she'd call me ungrateful or stupid. On top of that, I was grounded for a long time. While my sister got McDonald's for dinner, I had to eat leftovers from lunch. My mom would talk badly about me behind my back, even when she knew I could hear her. At the end of the year, my mom would always give us gifts for doing well in school. She'd make a little speech about how proud she was and how much she loved us. That year, she gave my sister a brand new iPhone, even though she had already gotten one at Easter. But my sister had complained about her phone being terrible, so my mom rushed to get her a new one. For me, she gave a hoodie and a candy. After my sister went upstairs to set up her new phone, my mom looked at me and said, "If you weren't so useless, you'd get an iPhone too." I don't care much about material things, but her words cut deep. Now, I barely tell my mom anything about school. I just say I'm doing okay and leave it at that. I'm too scared to share anything in case it leads to more yelling or worse. There are plenty of other stories, like the time my mom left me at my aunt's house while taking my sister on a nice beach vacation, or the time she almost kicked me out of the house because I disagreed with my sister. But those are stories for another day. Story 5. I have a friend who works for digital agencies doing analytics for large companies, including Fortune 500 corporations. Let's call him Dan. Typically, these agencies act as intermediaries, passing along the work to contractors and charging a percentage on top of the contractor's rate. Most of the time, they don't add much to the process or the final product. In some cases, they don't even bother assigning a project manager or account manager to oversee things. They just resell the contractor's services and collect their cut. Usually, these agencies are smart enough to stay quiet and not interfere with either the client or the contractor. They know they can't really justify the extra charges they tack on. But in this case, Dan's agency at the time, he was working with Cardinal Path, started demanding more detailed timesheets. Here's the thing, senior contractors, like Dan, often don't bother with detailed entries. They'll just write something simple like "worked" and charge 8 hours to that. The client understands what work is being done, so as long as the hours don't exceed the weekly cap, which is usually 40 hours, there's no problem. Naturally, Dan pushed back. He asked the client if they really needed that level of detail in the timesheets. The client had no issue with the simple timesheets and didn't request any changes. When Dan brought it up with the agency's management, they explained it was part of a new corporate policy. Since Dan had no choice but to comply, he got creative. He started billing the agency for the extra time he spent on these new tasks. He began charging for all sorts of non-client related activities, things the agency had been getting for free. This included two-factor authentications, handling corporate mass emails, any correspondence with agency staff like accountants, project managers, and teams, plus time wasted on useless corporate learning courses, and, of course, the time he spent filling out the more detailed timesheets. All in all, this added up to about 4 to 8 hours per week. Dan told the client that his availability on Fridays would be reduced because of the new requirements the agency imposed. He blocked off the entire day, avoiding any meetings. This essentially gave him Fridays off, while still getting paid. The client didn't mind at all. In fact, they kind of liked it because their own staff often had half days on Fridays, and production releases weren't allowed on that day anyway. It also meant they'd be paying the agency less on Fridays since there'd be fewer billable hours. Now, the agency was in a tough spot. Not only were they losing 4 to 8 hours of billable work each week, but those hours became a liability because they were now paying for them. Dan's rate at the time was over $100 an hour, but let's assume it was exactly $100 for simplicity. The agency likely charged the client double, around $200 per hour. So, every week, the agency was losing around $600 in profit and paying out an additional $600 to cover those hours. That's a total loss of $200 a week, all because of their demand for more detailed timesheets. As expected, the agency freaked out. There was a lot of back and forth, but in the end, no, they didn't drop the requirement. If you've ever worked with bureaucracies, you'll know that's not how they operate. Instead, they just rolled with it. Dan kept working there for another year, enjoying his Fridays off while still being paid for them. Eventually, he decided to leave when the agency began pushing new corporate contracts onto their contractors. These contracts had some strange requirements, one of which was that timesheets had to be filled out immediately after each task was completed. Dan pushed back, but the agency's director claimed they couldn't make any changes because the new contracts were coming from their parent company, which had recently acquired Cardinal Path. Dan moved on, but he definitely made the most out of that year, getting paid for his time while keeping the agency on their toes. Story 6. My wife's stepmom, let's call her Karen, has been in the picture for about 3 years now, and she's been a complete nightmare from the start. She's the kind of person who has to control everything and everyone around her, and my father-in-law, he just takes it all. He never stands up to her, so she's been pushing him around, changing his entire life. She even kicked out his 19-year-old son and banned him from the house. When he came back just to get his stuff, she called the cops on him for trespassing. Who does that? But that's just the beginning. She keeps making up new house rules that everyone has to follow. For example, no one is allowed to show up unannounced. I mean, really? My wife can't even stop by to drop off her brother and sister after picking them up from school without calling first? What's next? A written invitation to see your own dad? Then there's the dog rule. My father-in-law has had his dog for over 10 years. This poor dog is old and sick, but Karen decided that dogs are no longer allowed in the house. So now, the dog has to stay outside, no matter how much it's struggling. But it gets worse. Other people's dogs? Yeah, they're not allowed either. She made that rule right before my wife and I were going on vacation. My father-in-law had already agreed months ago to dog sit for us, but Karen put a stop to that. We had to scramble last minute to find someone else to watch our dog, just because she wanted to feel in control. And yet, her family can bring their dogs over whenever they want. The double standard is unreal. Oh, and then there's the Christmas gift fiasco. We all chipped in $200 each to get my father-in-law a $2,500 gun he'd been wanting for a long time. We thought it was a thoughtful gift from the whole family. Well, Karen conveniently forgot to mention that it was from all of us. She gave it to him as if it was just from her. Meanwhile, do you know what we got? A homemade triangle-shaped cutting board made from countertop scraps that my father-in-law found at his job site. He's a carpenter. Then she had the nerve to say, "Sorry, money's tight right now." Look, I'm not greedy or anything. If money's tight, fine, we could have set a $20 gift limit or something. But don't ask us to chip in for a huge, expensive gift and then act like you're struggling. The most recent thing happened about a month ago for my brother-in-law's birthday. They planned a dinner at a restaurant, set the date, and invited everyone. When the bill came, Karen casually announced that they could only pay for themselves because money's tight. My brother-in-laws both work part-time minimum wage jobs, and my sister-in-law is only 16 with no job. She still lives with them, by the way, so Karen wasn't even willing to cover her own daughter's meal or the birthday boys, even though they arranged the dinner. Of course, my wife and I ended up paying for the 5 of us, and we left. The kicker? Last weekend, we went over to their place and saw that both Karen and my father-in-law had brand new cars. They were Kias, sure, but still, brand new cars, but they couldn't cover a birthday dinner. Unbelievable. Now, here's where things get a little ironic. While we were all hanging out that weekend, Karen grabbed my drink by accident. It was a rum and coke, but she thought it was just coke. Now, Karen's been sober for 9 years and is part of a recovery program. I didn't say anything. I just watched her take a sip, realize what she'd done, and freeze. She knew what that meant. According to the program, she'd have to start over, admit she drank, and reset her sobriety count. I didn't feel bad about it either. It felt like a small piece of karma coming her way for all the nonsense she's put us through. So that's my life with Karen, my wife's stepmom. She's made family gatherings a nightmare, but at least there are small moments, like that rum and coke incident, that remind me she's not untouchable.